Texas Longhorns back in championship form, vying for a Big 12 championship for the first time in almost a decade. Of course, this is nothing new to the Oklahoma Sooners, as they have been the favorite and are looking for a fourth consecutive Big 12 championship. The two face off in a rematch, the first for the two schools since 1903. And, of course, the college football playoff appearance most likely on the line for Oklahoma. We bring in Steve Helwick, who does a work at the University of Texas's campus television station and also the Daily Texan. Steve joins us on a regular basis to break down the Longhorns and the Big 12. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to driving up to Dallas to see the scene tomorrow. I was there. Actually, this game will be in Arlington. First time the teams haven't played in Dallas in nearly a century. But they had the scene in Dallas back in week 6 of the season where Texas won 48-45, and I think the Sooners are looking for revenge, and Texas is looking to sustain the bragging rights. So we should have an interesting one there, with Texas potentially playing spoiler to Oklahoma's second straight college football playoff.
Yeah, I really don't know how to measure the motivation in particular here, because it's obvious for Oklahoma. Now for Texas, they have no shot at the college football playoff, and that's everybody's hyper-focused mindset. But to win the Big 12 championship would be claiming their stake back amongst the elite in college football, and basically saying that we're back, we're in ownership of the Big 12, and Oklahoma, we have finally reached that level and gotten back after nearly a decade. So it's a huge game for perception for a Big 12 championship if you're still into conference championships, which I am. I think they've been devalued, obviously, by the current system. But let's talk nuts and bolts of this Texas football team in regards to the Sam Ehlinger that we see vying for a Big 12 championship right now as a much more polished passer, a guy that's much more efficient and much more adept at the decision-making process as a passer, to add to his running skills this year over what we saw last season.
Well, before I talk about Ehlinger, I completely agree with your point that I think that we are honestly talking too much about college football playoffs now, where it is devaluing the rest of college football. And I think that's a great point that you make, where every single game in college football matters. And I hate to see like the bowl system and the conference champion system just get devalued just because of the hyper focus on 4 teams. So that's one thing. So I just think this should be viewed as just a huge game for Texas and for Oklahoma, not just for Oklahoma, because Texas has a lot on the line too. And every team participating in a football game this weekend has a lot on the line. But Sam Ehlinger, he's about as competitive as it gets. He's one of those very confident quarterbacks, very confident in his abilities, and as competitive as you'll find. Ehlinger, he's really developed this year. Last year, the story behind Ehlinger was he's good, but can he prevent making late game turnovers and mistakes? This year, he's actually done that. He went from the Maryland game this year to open the season to the Kansas game this year to close the regular season without throwing an interception. He threw 2 in the Maryland game, and he finally got some out of his system last week in the Kansas game. Had an excellent streak of not throwing an interception, playing mistake-free football, and that is how Texas has a 9-3 record right now. Ehlinger, he can also beat you with his legs. He's one of those guys, just a tough runner. He's not the fastest guy on the field, but he does like to take off for runs, and he's very good at breaking tackles. So he is a dual threat quarterback, you'd say, because if you don't contain Sam Ehlinger, and if you blitz him and you give him an opening, he's going to get 10, 15 yards, and he's one of those guys that fights for the extra yards. Texas loves using him on the goal line to run it in this year. He's run it in so many times that Texas has a really good goal line offense because of him.
So go right ahead.
Oh, as a passer, he's really developed his deep ball this year too, and that's one thing that's really helped him. His completion percentage has jumped up a whole 7 percentage points this year, and he's doubled his touchdowns while about halving his interceptions. So Ehlinger this season has just taken major strides from last year, and he's a true sophomore. I don't know if he's going to declare for the draft or anything after his junior year, but Texas could have 2 seasons with him left, which could be scary for a lot of teams in the Big 12.
Got Steve Helwick on the line from the Daily Texan, also does work for the University of Texas campus television station, breaking down the Big 12 title on the line between the two blue bloods, Oklahoma and Texas. Of course, everybody's wowed by the Sooners offense, but the one aspect of the game in the first matchup that stood out to me in terms of a Texas offensive advantage, Steve, was that Colin Johnson and little Jordan Humphrey had a huge size and physicality advantage over the smallish Oklahoma corners. They took advantage of that. They had big games. They high point the football. They're physical. They're freakish athletes. That seems to be a big advantage.
Definitely. Texas's receivers, they've also taken a lot of strides this year because Colin Johnson and Lil Jordan Humphrey, they're great receivers. And I'll get on Oklahoma's receivers in a bit, who are also maybe the best tandem in the nation. But Texas's receivers are a different breed in that they're the stronger physical strength type. They're the ones you can just lob the ball up to and they'll get jump balls. Lil Jordan Humphrey has done that so many times this year. And that Oklahoma does have smaller cornerbacks and that haven't really played well stopping the passing game all season long. I mean, this is a team that gave up 40 points to Kansas, so that could be a huge issue. I think Texas's key to the game offensively is getting the ball to Lil Jordan Humphrey and Colin Johnson as much as possible. Just 1 week ago, Texas struggled against Kansas, and Lil Jordan Humphrey was held to 2 catches, and Colin Johnson was held to 4 catches, and they were held a total of under 70 yards. So Texas is struggling when they're not getting the ball into their strong wideouts. That's basically the key to Texas's offense, since they haven't been able to establish a consistent running game ever since Mac Brown left the university. So the receivers will be the key to beating Oklahoma for the second time. You have to get it into Colin Johnson and Lil Jordan Humphrey because those guys proved it in the first Oklahoma game. In that game, Colin Johnson had 81 yards and a touchdown. Lil Jordan Humphrey had 133 receiving yards and a touchdown. That is how Texas can get on the board, score those 40-plus points.
And you talk about 40-plus points. That seems to be a pretty regular for any Oklahoma opponent, even if it's Kansas. It seems to be the low water mark. And Texas, depending on what style of offense and what style of approach they choose here to maybe squeeze the clock and slow it down and grind it out a little bit more. Obviously, they're going to be aggressive to a certain extent, but maybe a little bit more calculated. I'm interested about the Texas defense because even though they gave up 45 points in the first meeting, from what I remember, when they took it from being a tie game or one possession game to sprint out to that 21-point lead early in the fourth quarter, they basically went through, and I remember going through the analysis at the time, 4 or 5 consecutive possessions against Oklahoma, which is unheard of, where they really were chasing Kyler Murray around, boxed him in, covered the receivers, clamped down. And that was the difference in the game, is that you're not going to stop Oklahoma, but they are good enough and athletic enough on defense that they can have those stretches of time where they really befuddle them, confuse them, and match up well and shut them down for a stretch of time.
I honestly can't see that happening again, just even maybe 3 possessions in a row without Oklahoma scoring, given that Lincoln Riley is just a play-calling genius and always seems to read defenses really well. I think he struggled a little with the preparation against Texas, and Texas threw some things at him that he hadn't seen before in terms of how a team attacked Kyler Murray. But I think Texas's defense will struggle a lot because Kyler Murray, you saw what he did to West Virginia. West Virginia, they're a decent defense in the Big 12. They had the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year and David Long on their roster. Kyler Murray just tore that team apart last week. He played one of the games of his career, and I think he's going to do that again this week. Because Kyler Murray, the frustrations were so high after that Texas game. It's his only loss as an Oklahoma Sooner starting quarterback. In the press conference, he did not even want to say anything afterward. He was declining almost every single question or just keeping it to 2 or 3 words, just was frustrated, and that seems to continue this week. They asked Kyler Murray if he respects Sam Ehlinger's game, and he says he doesn't want to comment on that. So there's already beef between the quarterbacks. And I think Murray is going to come out with a level of intensity we haven't seen before, and that does not bode well for the Texas defense. If you're Texas, you're going to have to sacrifice maybe giving up some up-the-middle runs by having a QB contain, a QB spy on Kyler Murray, because we saw last time he played Texas, he had that long run down the sideline late in the game. And he did against West Virginia. He had that 55-yard run. Against Kansas, he ran for 70-something yards. He bolts off for these runs so often, and that's something that you're really going to have to limit in a game like this. So having a QB contain on Kyler Murray the entire game might be something that Texas has to do. Also, the Longhorns really need to guard the receivers. You cannot allow what West Virginia West Virginia allowed Marquise Hollywood Brown and CeeDee Lamb to combine for nearly 300 yards receiving. Marquise Brown had over 200, was scoring touchdowns left and right, and then CeeDee Lamb, he had that game-sealing catch when Kyler Murray had all the time in the world on that 4th and 5 late in the game. And just like Oklahoma's corners aren't really equipped to cover Texas's receivers, I don't know if Texas's corners are a little better than Oklahoma's, but I do not know if they can take the speed that Marquise Brown and CeeDee Lamb are going to give them, because those receivers have burned just about every coverage they've seen this year. And last game, I always say it, if you give Oklahoma 1 extra minute, the Sooners probably win that game. Because Cameron Dicker gets that field goal 48-45. All Oklahoma needs is 1 extra minute, and they probably win that game. Just because of how good their offense is.
You could also make the point, if you give them 2 extra minutes, then Texas comes back and scores because their defense is so bad.
That is true.
So, yeah, that seems to be the argument right now. I don't know where you stand on this. I'm a resume guy, a guy that says, okay, we can have all the eyeball tests we want. That's all very subjective versus the objective performance on the field. And unfortunately, we may result in an Oklahoma versus Ohio State situation in which I would believe neither team should be left out, but one has to be. And it would be difficult for me to decide because I think there are pros and cons on both sides that are fairly equal. So where do you stand on you've got the Ohio State bad loss that's weighing them down versus the Oklahoma great offense, and obviously the awful defense that a lot of football-oriented people that are really into the nuts and bolts say that defense can't compete in the college football playoff?
Well, as you mentioned, it is going to be tough to leave both teams out because personally, I think both are better than Notre Dame, but you're not going to leave an undefeated team out unless it's UCF, unfortunately. But they're not going to leave undefeated Notre Dame out of the playoff. So for me, I tweeted this a couple days ago, and I think, why is everyone focused on why Oklahoma's defense is so bad instead of how great their offense are? Because you can win football games in a myriad of different styles, and Oklahoma just has one way of winning a football game, which is just scoring 50-something on you to beat you. And they're 11-1, and their only loss came this year by 3 points. So Oklahoma's done. They win football games, and last year their defense was a little better, but they still didn't have a great defense, and they were a couple bad play calls probably away from beating Georgia in that all-time classic Rose Bowl, 54-48 game, just instant college football classic. Now, my thing about Ohio State is the 29-point loss to Purdue. You cannot evade that bad loss. And when Ohio State loses, they lose horribly. I think all their past 4 losses have come by double digits, multiple possessions. You had that Iowa loss last year and the Oklahoma loss last year. And then their 4th last loss was that Clemson game, which was a 31-0 in the Fiesta Bowl. When Ohio State loses, they lose badly, and that's one thing that continues to hurt their resume. Last year, that was a debate with Alabama. They were saying Alabama's a conference champ, but Ohio State losing by 31 to Iowa, which is exactly unacceptable. And I think losing by 29 to a 6-6 team could be the tiebreaker in this one, with that being Ohio State's only loss, because you look, Texas beat Oklahoma by 3 points, and that's a much better team than Purdue's loss. And then Oklahoma and West Virginia, Oklahoma and Ohio State have about the same best caliber win in Penn State and West Virginia. So I think that's about Michigan. How did I completely forget? Yes. I can't believe I said that. Ohio State did crush Michigan.
You got a lot of information stuffed in your head. I get it. I do the same thing.
Absolutely destroyed Michigan just like they do almost every year. So Ohio State got another big win there. But I honestly, I have to say Oklahoma. And one more thing you have to look at is Oklahoma's currently higher ranked. Oklahoma's opponent this weekend is 9-3 Texas. Ohio State is lower ranked than Oklahoma. Their opponent this weekend is 8-4 Northwestern. No matter what Ohio State does to Northwestern, I think the committee is going to view a win over Texas better, just because Northwestern, I compare them to a random number generator of a football team. You don't know what you're getting out of Northwestern. Some weeks they're beating Rutgers by one possession and losing to Akron, and then other weeks they're waxing Wisconsin and Michigan State. Northwestern, they're ranked 8-4, but how good of a team really are they? I don't think the College Football Playoff Committee is going to put too much stake in Ohio State's performance against Northwestern compared to Oklahoma's against Texas, with Texas being the only team to beat Oklahoma. If Oklahoma beats Texas, then they cleared their entire schedule, beating every single team they played in 2018. So I think regardless of Saturday's outcomes, an Oklahoma win, unless paired with a Georgia win over Alabama, Oklahoma win should put them into the playoff.
So I would throw out the rankings first and foremost, because if you're going to rank teams based on other rankings, you're basically you're on a treadmill. So basically what we're doing is we're saying Texas is better than Northwestern because we ranked them higher. I don't know that the resume, sure, it's one game better, but yeah, I personally think that Texas might be a little bit better than Northwestern, but I don't think it's much. I think Northwestern's just devalued by the stereotype. But if you look at the resume, it's really impressive what they've done in the last couple of months. Sure, they got off to an awful start. They lost to Akron. That's if you're just taking the resume and you're weighting each game equally, which I would do actually, because I think that's fair. But if you talk about who are the best teams right now, Northwestern has beaten Michigan State, Wisconsin, Iowa, a Minnesota team that's much better now, Purdue. They've racked up a lot of. They took took Notre Dame to a 2-minute game in the last couple minutes, down by 3. They took Michigan to a 3-point game. They've played extremely well. The Ohio State argument I find interesting when people start to go back years, because I thought we were evaluating teams on 2018, because if we want to throw out like all decade teams, then we can go back. If we're going to go back to 2016, and I'm not necessarily targeting you because I hear this all over the place. If we're going to go back and hold 2016 against Ohio State, well, why don't we go back to 2015? They had one of the best teams in the country, if not the best team in the country. If we go back to 2014, they won the national championship. So you could say, well, Ohio State, when they lose badly, and we don't want to see that in the college football playoff. We could also say Oklahoma hasn't proven that they can win a national title, and Urban Meyer and Ohio State has. So why wouldn't we put them in?
Oh, I was just using that just as a fun stat that Ohio State.
I completely understand, because other people do that on a consistent basis, but I thought we were evaluating the current teams, but this seems to be hanging over Ohio State's head. And if that's what happens in terms of public perception, that's fine. But if it happens within that committee, then the system is completely broken. If we're evaluating teams on what they did 2 years ago.
That would be some crazy revenge for the Big 12 if Oklahoma gets in over Ohio State with about even resumes, just because of what happened in 2014 with TCU, Baylor, and Ohio State in that mix there, where TCU drops from 3 to 6 in the last poll, and Ohio State bumps up with that win over Wisconsin in the Big 10 title game. So we might see a reverse 2014 here, where the Big 12 actually beats out Ohio State.
Sure. And it looks like it's going to happen because, as you mentioned, I think your logic in regards to what should happen and what's actually going to happen within that committee room is right on. That Oklahoma has the 5 spot, Ohio State the 6, and there's an obvious reason why. Ohio State has an awful loss, Oklahoma does not. So I have no issue with that. I think it's a horrible system when we've got to judge wins and losses, but that's where we are. So that's what we have to do, and that's the tiebreaker, regardless of whether I know there are people out there. Colin Cowherd is one who says, I want the best NFL teams out there. I basically, when it comes down to it, I want to see the teams that give me the highest ceiling. And so Ohio State, I guarantee, has more NFL players on their roster than Oklahoma does, especially defensively. It's for as poorly as they've played, it's they've got 8 starters that are going to play in the NFL. That's just the way it is. And Oklahoma probably is 2 or 3. But that's no way to rate teams. But it's kind of a thought as to, if we're just going to select the 4 best teams based on potential and NFL talent on the field, then Ohio State gets the nod. But evaluating losses, unfortunately, that's where we are, is we have to knock teams for losing games and how poorly they looked or how dominant they looked. And that's where we are. And that's why Alabama gets a pass, because they've been that dominant. And even if they lose, they probably get the pass, even though they can't win their own conference and get into the playoffs. So the whole thing's a mess from my standpoint, but it also makes for good debate.
And instead of having to evaluate losses, although it's really unfortunate given the situation that McKenzie Milton's in, you could have just thrown in the 4 teams that went perfect this year if they all won their conference championship games. That'd be another solution, with a team winning 24 straight and not getting a chance, which shows another sign of maybe a broken system when it's the only sport where not every team can run the table. Because a 24-game win streak in the 21st century is just unheard of. Florida State did it a few years ago. Miami did it in the early 2000s. Other than that, teams don't win 24 straight really in college football. So unfortunately, the McKenzie Milton injury is really going to take UCF back. That's like taking away Kyler Murray from Oklahoma or a Lamar Jackson from Louisville a couple of years ago, a player that affects his team so much with everything he does. But I think it'd be cool to see a system where any team that we're winning is regarded as the most important stat. And the 4 teams, Alabama, Clemson, Notre Dame, and UCF, could all enter with perfect resumes, and that would be an interesting playoff to watch, with every team entering with perfection.
It's certainly a valid point. That's the schedule in front of them, and theoretically, the group of 5 is supposed to be included or considered, but this would basically prove that they're not. 2 consecutive years, undefeated team, and that's where I do say that even though we just evaluate the current season, there's an obvious connection between the 2 teams, last year's and this year. So they've won 24 consecutive games or whatever the number is. And they're going to be left out. And then they even proved last year, again, it's a different team, but this is the argument. They actually proved against a top 10 team from the SEC that they could beat them. And ironically, that was the team that beat the 2 teams that went to the championship game. So I don't know what else they need to do besides schedule tougher, and they can't anticipate who's going to be tough. And I don't know who wants to schedule them at this point. Obviously, they were scheduling these non-conference games 5 years ago when they were inconsequential at that point, but they seem to maul everybody out of the Power 5 that they face, and they're not great teams. But wouldn't it be funny if Pitt won the ACC championship and Central Florida beat them by 31 points?
Definitely, that's all the interesting talk. Just, I said the team, I don't even know if they beat Memphis Saturday with Daryl Mack as their quarterback, but it's been one heck of a ride under Milton the last 2 years.
Steve Helwick's on the line. You can join him on the Daily Texan, also the University of Texas campus television station. Steve, we know you got a huge day in front of you, a lot of travel, and you got to get to the Big 12 championship game tomorrow, so we appreciate you stopping by.
Thanks for having me on. Enjoy your weekend of football.